Welcome to Leadership Bites with myself, your host, Guy Bloom. This is a leadership podcast where I have conversations with colleagues, I chat with guests, and sometimes there'll be just me talking. You can connect with me at livingbrave.com, and when you enjoy the episode, subscribe and please tell everyone. Boom, here we go. So, Andrew, fantastic to have you on this episode of Leadership Bites. Welcome.
Thanks for having me.
So I know who you are, and I always start these episodes off by just asking the person just to introduce themselves and just set the scene for the role that you inhabit.
Yeah, sure. So my name is Andrew Tenzer. I am the Director of Market Insight and Brand Strategy at Reach PLC. If you're not aware of Reach, we're the largest commercial news publisher in the UK, and I guess we'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. Essentially, I am in charge of a number of different areas, really. One is providing market and audience insight to many stakeholders across the business. I'm also responsible for driving brand strategy for many of our iconic news brands. And I've now moved more into the executional element as well. So I now run a team who are responsible for creating engaging brand-led content to reach new audiences, particularly younger audiences in youth audience platforms like your TikToks and your Instagrams and Snapchat, etc.
I've just started up my first my TikTok channel.
Going for it.
I literally started it up over the weekend.
How did you find it?
Well, it was very it's very interesting, and this is one of these conversations that's going to dip and dive as we go.
Yeah.
But what's fascinating is what I've noticed is, and I'm sure it's similar, that I used to be all about Facebook, and now I can't remember the last time I went on Facebook. Then I was all about Instagram. Since I've had TikTok, I don't think I've been on Instagram.
Yeah, it's addictive. Yeah, it's very, very addictive. In a way that I think probably some platforms had a while back, but I mean, it's just the amount of time people spend on TikTok is just crazy.
And I think what I find incredible as well, and we'll pull ourselves back to the conversation in a minute, but this is kind of part of it, is just the just like with products and that kind of the lifespan of a product and the disposability, I guess, of a product. It's incredible to see that platforms also have that almost obsolescence that they themselves probably can't recognize because they ride a crest and a high and they go, sit with the lords of the world, and then boom, the next minute. I mean, they're still enormous, but then this other machine comes along, and I can't imagine what would come after TikTok, but I know something's going to come.
Yeah, I think about that a lot, actually, because obviously we have to think about the future and how things might develop. And yeah, you're right. At the moment, it feels like, what could possibly come along that could be the next big thing. But it probably hasn't even been invented yet.
Well, there's some 14-year-old about to do it.
I'm sure.
So listen, talk to me about iconic brands. What are the iconic brands that Reach has under its umbrella? And that'll just help give a sense of your kind of your playground, so to speak.
Yeah, so we have a big mix of news brands and other titles. So our kind of big national brands like the Mirror. We also have the Daily Star and the Express. We also own OK Magazine, which I'm sure everyone is aware of. And then we also own about 70 websites and regional brands across the UK. So many iconic titles like the Manchester Evening News, the Liverpool Echo, Chronicle Live. So there isn't really a city or location in the UK where we aren't present. These are brands that some of them going back 100 years. So we're very proud of the number of titles that we have within our portfolio.
So I came across you on, I think it may have been Instagram actually.
Oh, was it TikTok?
Or maybe it was TikTok.
Must have been TikTok.
I think it was TikTok then.
Must have been TikTok. Yeah.
Maybe I'm not quite sure if I was on it then, but yeah, I wasn't on it, but I was browsing it. That's right. You've got me there. And I saw you on I think I'd call it a panel interview.
Yeah.
And there was you were asked. There was a particular question that was posed to the panel. And everybody I'm going to let you bring it to life so I don't mess it up by telling half a story. But what caught me was two things. A, what you said and brought to the conversation. But B, was how the response was relatively generic from everybody. And when I say generic, that doesn't mean necessarily it wasn't valid, but it was almost what you'd expect. And then you kind of came left field and went, well, actually, now you've asked, boom, and off you went. And I was like, hello. And so can I just get you to bring to life, what it was, why you were there, what the topic was, maybe the question that was posed, and just how you came at it. And I know that's putting a lot of the onus onto you, but I really don't want to mess it up by getting that wrong.
No, that's fine. So that the event in question was an event about social purpose marketing strategies.
Yes.
So lots of brands consider, taking a stance on a political issue as a means to driving greater business success. And this is the prevailing orthodoxy within the marketing and advertising industry. And it gets talked a lot by very senior people in the industry, that almost like it's a brand's responsibility to kind of save the world, and how the advertising industry can save the world. And over the last sort of 5 years, alongside my co-author Ian Murray from House 51, we've published a number of kind of big studies to the industry, which essentially challenges current thinking, the current orthodoxy, not just on social purpose marketing strategies, but lots of different things. And one of the things that has been the focus of our research is how advertising and marketing is one of the most elitist professions in the UK. And basically we've proved through kind of many different techniques that people working in advertising and marketing unconsciously see, experience and interpret the world differently to the general population. And in relation to one of the things that we've talked about a lot in our research is that whilst we think that social purpose marketing influences buying decisions, actually all the evidence that we have suggests that this just isn't the case. It isn't a key factor. So the reason I get asked to talk a lot at these sorts of panels is because their purpose is such a big subject in the industry. And as someone who maybe challenges the current orthodoxy, I get invited along. And as far as I'm concerned, I don't feel like I'm saying anything controversial. It's backed up by hard research and evidence, and I think the challenge is essentially what I said at that that came across in that TikTok was essentially that we're here discussing whether social purpose marketing and what social purpose brands should go after in their advertising, what causes should they take on. And the point I was making is that, we're currently in a cost of living crisis, and people don't sit at home all day thinking what a brand, worrying about what a brand thinks or believes or even behaves. They're thinking about, how am I going to pay my next bill? The research published recently found that, 50% of bill payers are saying that they're really struggling to pay their bills, and that's increased significantly just over the past 4 months. And so the idea that people are going to buy brands beyond kind of that might have a higher purpose when people are thinking quite inwards at the moment because of the challenges they're facing, and for some reason speaking what I think not to be, I don't consider it to be that controversial. However, it challenges the current orthodoxy. And that's why I think it took on kind of a life of its own and had, hundreds of thousands of views on TikTok, and, drove lots of, debate about it. And, it was, it's always interesting. I did one last week at Adweek, and a similar discussion. And, like I said, it doesn't feel controversial to me, but people say, oh, it's very brave to say that in a marketing conference or things like that. But, I'm interested in the truth, what works best for brands in terms of how they're going to grow their businesses.
So without turning it into, because I know what I'm like, once you ask me on a topic that I'm actually interested in, I'm like, well, hold my beer, because I can talk about this for the next 3 weeks. So just, what is the essence of what it is that you're offering that is, and I like that phrase, I don't see that. I don't see this as particularly, well, it might be challenging, but I'm not trying to be disruptive. Here's the data, and if I'm happy to be wrong, but until somebody shows me something to the contrary, it turns out I might be right. So, what are you highlighting? What are you bringing out to bring that challenge?
In what sense?
Well, what is your position around? If we bring that question that was asked on the panel, and maybe bring your answer to life that you gave.
Yeah, so I mean, over the last sort of 3 or 4 years, we've been doing a lot of research around buying behaviours and factors that influence buying, and it's really interesting because a lot of what we do to our kind of marketing and advertising community is show them how out of touch they are with the general population. Obviously, marketeers and ad people are meant to be, or they position themselves as experts in the understanding of people. But it turns out that when we put this to the test, they get it wrong quite a lot of the time in terms of understanding motivations, aspirations of the general public. So when it comes to buying, it's quite simple, really. We as a researcher by trade, you have to make sure you ask the question correctly, and you're able to take into the nuances of how people actually buy. So essentially what happens a lot of the time in the industry is people will publish research which is quite biased and leading. So as an example, if I said to you, would you agree that you're more likely to buy a brand that does, good things to the environment? Of course you're going to say yes. And then I might say to you, okay, so when was the last time you bought something from Amazon? And you'll most likely say, in the last week or the last 2 weeks. In fact, I buy from that quite regularly. 24 hours or do 24 minutes. Yeah. So I think there's a challenge there, because often what people say and what people do is different. And there's also social desirability at play. So you have to ask these questions in a way which doesn't get fully to the bottom of it, because no one can replicate a proper buying consumption situation, but there are techniques where you can get a hierarchy of what's important. And essentially the way we've done it is, what it finds is that people who buy brands based on a political belief of a brand or a stance on a particular issue is round about 9 to 10% of UK adults who say that when they buy brands they consider that. That's probably slightly more due to social desirability bias than the actual truth. But what comes out massively at the top, at 80%, is things like price, value, reliability, all of the things that I think the industry has considered, these are just hygiene factors, and that things like a political stance or a social stance is actually a differentiator, where actually if everyone's doing it, then it's not very distinctive at all. But the interesting thing with our research is we do a lot of research amongst marketeers and advertisers, and here's the interesting thing, because if you ask marketeers and advertisers the factors that influences their buying, they score very low on those social purpose things too. And then when we ask them, to predict which factors people buy, they predict those factors to be very low as well. So it's really interesting, because then what happens is that no one really believes that people buy based on those kind of a political stance on a social issue or things like that. But it's become kind of like the prevailing orthodoxy within the industry. A few people start talking about it, and it's all of a sudden. And this is the thing: is I think it's a small cohort of the industry who are kind of at the top, who are kind of forcing down a narrative and orthodoxy, which I don't think genuinely most people really believe in. And this is only from a marketing strategy perspective, when I have to caveat this all the time, because when it comes to things like diversity and inclusion, purpose inwards in your own organization and doing the right thing, absolutely, those things are incredibly important. We need to be sustainable. We need to focus on being a more diverse industry. And if brands want to donate money to the World Wildlife Fund or anything, just do that anyway. Like, you don't need to market it, because it's not going to be as effective as you think it is. So I guess that's where I'm coming from.
This is fascinating. There's a lot for me going on here, because and please, my naivety might be a beautiful thing here, or it might be it might just be what it is, naive. So course correct me. But if you say two things are £10, one of them has social purpose and the other one isn't, which one are you more likely to buy? I can imagine, the one with social purpose. Why? Well, they're both £10, so that might sway me. One's 10, one's 20, but the one with 20 has social purpose. Which one are you going to buy? Well, and if I am one of the 10% who's geared that way, I might very well buy that. But the majority would maybe at that point go, well, if all things were equal, I'm going to go for that. But if they're not,
and I think that's the point, is that all things are never equal. Right. So if you think about all the different factors that go into buying a product, it's knowing the brand in the first instance, the value you've had from it previously, all of those types of things. So this is the challenge of, in a very basic sense, yes, if I had exactly the same product in front of me and one was recyclable and one wasn't, and it was the same price, I probably would choose, I know I would choose the recyclable one. I think we all would. But the simple fact is that kind of option is never really as simple as that. But the interesting thing on people that would buy, I guess what I'd call ideological buyers, like people who are really kind of your conscious consumers, which verified through other books shows around about 9 to 10% of the population. But the interesting thing about those people is they're much more cynical about brand claims anyway. So the brands that are kind of pushing social purpose, these big, like, they're not gonna be the type of brands that these people are going to buy anyway. They're going to be looking for your sustainable, organic, don't want to fund these big businesses, etc., etc. So and they're also just much more skeptical about brand claims, because the interesting thing within all of this is that the question everyone needs to ask themselves is, are brands credible agents of social change? And all our research suggests in most cases probably not. So only 17% of UK adults trust brands to act in a socially responsible way. That's actually lower than the government by about 15 percentage points in the research we've done. So the idea that brands have this kind of right to kind of push social change upon us, I would say they lack the credibility there, because people just ultimately don't really trust them to do the right thing.
And again, I have a client that was one, and I absolutely won't say who they are, but they are a fantastic group of people, and they do an incredible product that I have in this house, and I just make sure it's now not on display actually behind me. So there we go. No, it's not. Quick check. Right.
I was going to say, I was just doing a recce. I just realised
it's just there, so I'm just going to keep it there. But the point is, totally credible, beautiful product. love everything about it, purchased by a global phenomenon, who completely aren't like that, but they bought this niche product. So when we say, are brands credible, the answer is yes, sometimes. Like I use an underarm deodorant that's, completely not got any chemicals in it, and it's blinking fantastic up until the point some bugger buys it. And then I wonder, when does it then stay as it is and it's still a very credible product, and I can trust it, or does the fact that it's been now owned by this global entity, does it now get tainted in my mind, even though it's not changed?
Yeah.
I suppose there's all these variables going on and that 10% then of people that are really paying attention, they would pay attention to things like that. They'd know who owns what. But the average person wandering around the street, they're going to see that niche brand, and they won't know maybe that it never really existed in the first place. It was created like that, so there's only a few that will peel back the curtain and have a look behind, I think is maybe.
Yeah, I think that, most, like I said, and have said many times, people are not sitting at home thinking about what a brand believes or even behaves, to be honest, because, you only have to look at, like I said, with Amazon, huge, the way they've treated their workers, and lots of scandals involving many of these big companies, including Facebook. I mean, yes, we talk about people moving away from Facebook, but they're still a global organization that people use and still spend huge amounts of time with. So I think there is I think that with anything, people in the industry obsess about things which most people don't really care about, and of course that's our job as marketeers and people that are there about. But equally, we're there trying to understand people, and unfortunately, there is a bit of a market orientation gap. And I think that's because we are quite far removed in terms of our social background, etc., which kind of creates that gap.
So am I hearing from you? So I'm, again, looking at the world and what's happening in academia with pronouns and, that kind of, especially in the US, that incredibly kind of, I want to be careful when I say the word woke, but the negative version of it, where there's this ultra sensitivity around language and gender. And that, to me, you got the whole world that's getting on with its life, going to Tesco's and Sainsbury's or Walmart or whatever it's doing. And then you've got a very small percentage of the population in academia who are focusing on verbal linguistics and, ultra kind of linear thought processes. And I wonder if that's typical, where at the top of any genre or any whatever it is, you've got that elite group that eventually gets so far above themselves that they start to go into their own little ecosystem. They start to go into their own way of being. And if I'm hearing from you correctly in marketing, is it because there's a lot of middle class, upper middle class, they've gone to university, they're looking at it through a very singular lens? Is that part of what that is? Because again, I see that in academic scenarios. It's an ecosystem.
Well, it's elites. It's elites, isn't it? So without wanting to go into things like pronouns and stuff like that, because
let's not do that.
I don't think it's probably the right discussion. But yes, essentially, there's a very good book on this called the Class Ceiling by Daniel Lorison and Sam Friedman. And this is where I guess the inspiration for our study, the aspiration window that we published a couple of years ago, actually during the first lockdown, we published it. The inspiration. So my co-author Ian Murray from House 51 had been talking about this for a long time, and initially in our previous work we talked about left-leaning versus right-leaning, and the marketing and advertising industry, self-identifies as left-leaning, etc. But actually, when we took it down to the class social mobility argument, it became a lot clearer. So essentially what you find is that 70% of people working in advertising and marketing grew up in a household where the highest income earner was social grade AB, and that's compared to 29% of the UK population. And all of the research we've done, we've used lots of different techniques from the world of social sciences, from cultural psychology. We've done all these tests on people in a big UK population sample and people working in marketing and advertising. And essentially, as I said at the beginning, what we find is that people in advertising and marketing and kind of people who are at the kind of top end of society, they just see the world differently because their experiences are different. And yes, this is a case of often you're talking to yourselves, and that's just not a marketing and advertising thing. I'm sure it's the same in the legal profession. I'm sure it's the same in lots of professions. I think we saw that under Jeremy Corbyn for Labour, where you had a very small group of kind of activists who believed that what they thought everyone else believed, because they mostly lived on things like Twitter. Twitter is not representative of the UK population in any way, shape or form, yet it feels like certainly from a political perspective, and these niche arguments is where people live on it, and then they take that application and apply it to the real world. It's very far removed.
It's lazy as well, some of it, I think. And I don't know what you think about this, that it's not reaching out of yourself and reaching out of your environment. So Twitter's easy. I don't have to go anywhere. There is my answer. I don't have to go to the streets of Liverpool or Manchester or Glasgow and wander around and speak to humans because, everybody's on Twitter, aren't they? No, there's about 4% of the population on Twitter.
Yeah, I mean, well, it's the key thing about Twitter as well is that a lot of people don't even, it's a very small minority who constitute most of the conversation on there, the very loud minority. And I think it warps our sense of what's going on in the UK. But I do think that that the industry, the difference between the advertising and marketing industries and things like legal, let's say, is that the advertising and marketing industry is having to communicate to the whole population. They've got to identify things that are relevant to those audiences, that will help them, will help us to sell our products more effectively. And I think there is a real problem, and I think it's going to take a long time to fix. And I think it's been, it reflects the wider changes of society that have been going on probably for the last 20 years. If you've not read The Road to Somewhere by David Goodhart, his book was something that really kind of turned me on to the whole thing. I read it. I joined what was we're Reach now, but we were Trinity Mirror back in the day, and I joined just after a few months after the EU referendum, and I started reading these various books, but The Road to Somewhere really stood out to me because David Goodhart talked about the somewheres and the anywheres and how they used to be much closer together in society, and then the anywheres, who were kind of like this small liberal elite, had basically just parted and moved further away from the kind of general population. And I think that's just reflected in many areas of life. So I don't think the advertising and marketing industry is any different. It's just a microcosm of what's been going on in society. And even things like COVID, I think that was a classic example of lockdown. 50% of the population didn't have the luxury of working from home. It was a very class-based impact, really, on everything. And I always think back to my history teacher at school, who would say about British history, like the words she would always say is, one thing you need to remember is class underpins everything. And it's something that as I've got older, it's made me realise, it's still as relevant today as it was. I know obviously the boundaries have changed and we're living much, we've never had it so good in terms of, our living conditions and whatnot. But it's still something that rings true to me, because I think there's a general perception, certainly amongst as I've experienced in media and the advertising industry, etc., is that class divide doesn't really exist anymore, because everyone has an iPhone and all of these things, but actually still very, very relevant, very relevant.
And class divide or versus financial divide. And I'm not even smart enough to start to talk about the differences too specifically, other than the haves and the have-nots, or the people with money and without. I was just watching somebody I think this morning, and he was just talking about, look, I work in a factory. I work hard. I put some money away. I try. I'm a good person, and blah blah blah. But I know you're just saying about how much he earns. I earn about £38,000 a year, and stuff like that. And you think. And the effect of what's happening right now in the world, he said, it was all right at first, but now I'm having to, I'm not turning the heating on. Now I'm not. Why? Because, I was living at a level. I don't have I have a Ford Escort or whatever you were saying he had, probably not, but something, it was all of a level, he was living to his means. And I do think that is very interesting, where you have people that it may be biting in, but I still go shopping at Marks and Spencer's. We may not have a holiday this year, but that's fine, because we won't be turning off the lights or not streaming Netflix. Or the way the world seems to affect people, I don't know if that's, maybe that is still class, but there's something there about the financial realities for people.
Yeah, and I think it's more than just financial realities. I think we've done some interesting stuff over the last few years around quality of life, and then by household income. So, generally, of course, people rate their quality of life. The more they earn, the higher their quality of life. But actually, it's relatively flat until you get to the sort of, highest earning 10%, where you start to see a steeper line in terms of quality of life. But what's really interesting as well is we ask people working in marketing and advertising to predict or estimate people's quality of life at different levels of income, and it's interesting because essentially they underestimate the quality of life for anyone earning under sort of 50 grand a year or more, and then they massively overestimate the quality of life for people earning sort of 50, 60 grand plus.
Their life must be better because they're earning more,
exactly.
Right?
So it's a more materialistic
viewpoint,
framework in which they apply. But I think you're absolutely right. There is with the cost of living, there will be. It's about that value, isn't it? It's what do I value that I can still keep, but get rid of something else. But the cost of living is that's something that going to have a huge impact on not just the advertising industry, but businesses and brands. And we're only at the start of it, really, because once the other price hikes come in October, I think it is, then it's a concerning picture, I think.
I'm interested, Andrew, because I focus on the leadership space. The podcast is called Leadership Bites, and what drew me to you was just what you were talking about and all of this that we've been saying. But there's internal comms. There's organizations that are obviously trying to win hearts and minds, and they're in essence marketing internally, though never enough energy normally goes into that. But I again see a link between that top echelon having sometimes an echo chamber of their own voice coming back at them, because they are very often having people play the game upwards and echo back what they think that senior team want to hear. There's no rocket science in me saying that. And so there is something about when a brand is advertising potentially at a more esoteric level versus the reality. There was a film, I think we may have spoke about it when we chatted briefly, but was it with Dudley Moore? And he was an advertising, and he suddenly just started to tell the truth. there's an old film, and it's got Dudley
Yeah.
Moore, and I'm sure it's Dudley Moore, and he plays somebody in advertising, and I think he gets hit on the head or something, and all he can do is tell the truth. Things like Volvo, boxy but safe. And he just starts telling the truth in advertising. And of course, the response is phenomenal. And of course, he's hailed as some guru. And how do you do it? And he's going, well, I'm just telling the truth. Yeah, but what's your angle? No, there is no angle. I'm just saying it as it is. And they just can't wrap their head around it because it doesn't.
Well, there is a bias called the Pratfall Effect, which brands don't use enough of.
Right.
Where they essentially just sort of tell the truth in their advertising, and it like you said, be honest and show a weakness, because actually there's a whole lot of academic research which finds that people that show a weakness are more trusted. They're more so
is that Marmite? Love it or hate it.
Yeah, exactly. And
you might not like it, and that's okay.
You might not like it. And like you say, like the old classic kind of VW ads from the 50s and 60s, and some of the classic ones where it's like, faster than a Ferrari when the Ferrari's not moving, that type of thing. That's based on research, academic research, where they did these cool experiments where someone went into a room to give a talk and they drop a glass of water over themselves, and then they start talking, and then in one they don't, and then it turns out that people are much more trustworthy and like the one that dropped the water versus the one that didn't. So it's an effect, it's a bias which isn't tapped into enough, I think. But to your point about inward purpose, absolutely, those are the things you have to balance, don't you? I think I still think that as I said it at the Adweek panel I did last week on this, is that I think we should be looking at inward purpose rather than outward purpose. Because I think that if you're a business that is focused on making your that employee engagement piece, make it more attractive for people to come and work, get it culturally right, show that we're being sustainable, we're doing these things, we're focusing on diversity and inclusion, we want to get a more diverse workforce, we want to get more cognitive diversity, all of those I think can be done inwards. I don't think anyone's necessarily going to be complaining if the brand that they own, for instance, is advertising something unrelated to a higher purpose. I think it's very easy for people to say, well, inward purpose automatically leads to outward purpose, but I think they're two very, very different things. And there are lots of brands out there that will donate money to various causes but never put it in their marketing or advertising, because they're doing it because they want to do it, it's the right thing to do, rather than doing it to try and sell something. Which whatever way you look at it, people can look at that cynically, so to speak. So there's nothing wrong doing it if your business is grounded in social purpose. Take brands like Patagonia or Tony's Chocolonely, which is focused around how chocolate is made and things like that. Absolutely, that's core to their brand. So that's your distinctiveness. It's when you get other examples where it's almost like social purpose should be a business strategy, not a marketing strategy. But all too often, it's the other way round. It's a marketing strategy, but it's not really core to the business and who they are.
So when you get a product that its entire persona is, say, socially based, is there also something then about balancing that reality with what the actual decision-making criteria of somebody is who isn't that way orientated? Because otherwise your audience is going to be very, very small.
Well, that's a really good point. I was talking to someone about this last week in reference to Tony's Chocolonely, because I don't know if you ever had it, but
I've never even heard of it.
It's pretty expensive. I mean, it's an expensive chocolate bar, and it's it's expensive. It's clearly going after a very niche audience. Its whole purpose is around, fair trade, how people are treated when they're making the chocolate. I can't remember the exact ins and outs of it. And I was thinking to myself, well, yes, you're right there, because ultimately, if I don't really buy a product based on that, well, we know that's not a key buying behavior. Otherwise, why are Cadbury so big? Why are Nestle so big, etc.? They obviously don't, Nestle and things like that don't focus on kind of those types of things in their advertising. But you're right that it's niche, because ultimately when I look at their advertising, I think to myself, oh, why don't you just focus on the product for once? Because it actually is really good. I mean, it is really good. Some of the best chocolate I've ever had. But you wouldn't. But the problem is, and also if you want to look, it's very expensive. So if they want to expand and grow their business, then they might have to produce cheaper alternatives, etc., etc. And it's that point in which you think, well, actually, you're going to have to tell people about the product.
You could turn around and say, do you remember Stella Artois? It was reassuringly expensive, right? Yeah. And you could go, listen, we're expensive, and here's why: because we pay fair and blah blah blah. But here's another thing: it tastes amazing.
Yeah, but they don't do that. Yeah, exactly. They don't really focus on from the marketing I've seen. I've not seen any of them focus. Their communications focus on the product itself.
One of my clients who I was talking about earlier, I'm going to literally send him this before I edit it. I'm going to go, I want you to watch this, because I think their product is better than the other products that are cheaper, that are synonymous with what they do. And I've said to a couple of other people, just try it. And they've gone, oh, it's way better than A, B, C, and D. But that's not how they advertise. They advertise on their raison d'etre in the world and all this kind of stuff. So it is a little bit more expensive, it is. But I was given a freebie. I was at the head office and they loaded me up and I went, oh, thanks very much. Never have normally bought this because, for whatever reason, went home, started using it and went, oh, it's brilliant. Better. Now I would buy it, not because of, weirdly enough, because of what they represent, but now I think it's a better product.
But that's the thing, like the goal of marketing is to take people who would never buy it to buying it, to trying it, because the thing is there is a belief that attitude, that what comes first is attitude and then behavior follows. Most of the time what happens is behavior and then attitude follows. So you've got to get people to use the product before you can, do you see what I mean? So it's kind of like the goal of marketing should always be what levers do I need to pull in order to get this person in category who never buys my brand to at least buy it once, and then because that's what will drive your volume.
If it's good enough, it will have an impact.
Yeah.
If it's a mediocre product, then getting it in their hand won't prove anything. But so if I'm hearing you there, get it in somebody's hand, they try it, and if it is significant quality, they'll go, oh, and it'll be a disturbance to their frame of reference.
Yeah, and that's the point, is that for instance, like a Tony's Chocolonely, it's very hard for that to be a mass product, just mass market product, because it's very expensive. But also they don't focus on the product at all. And why will people? There's a value exchange, right? It's about getting people to trial it in the first instance, which is very, very difficult to do if you don't really know anything about the product, because they're not telling you about it beyond it's made by, we're campaigning against
Tony,
the way people are treated, etc. Yeah, maybe Tony. But I think that is the challenge for kind of those kind of niche brands. But it's very good chocolate. I feel like
Well,
I'm
number one, they're
marketing the
going to
product
sell at least.
myself.
They're going to sell at least one more bar because
Yeah.
I'm going to go and order
Well,
one.
exactly, go straight out and buy it. Yeah.
At least one.
Yeah. Well, they
I
should
think-
go into influencer marketing.
Yeah, exactly. We'll just do podcast episodes and
Yeah,
stuff
yeah.
that we want to say. So I think what I'm thinking about internal comms, there is something here around really challenging, I guess, what it is that you, not you think that you're, not what you're trying to get across, but the manner of it. And I don't see people researching in some respects in a manner as you have done within organizations to speak to people at the different levels of the organization, not to say do you agree with the message, but what's your engagement with the message and what's the manner of it. Because when you get organizations talking about profit or EBITDA or various phraseology, the average human being, and even, our CEO is moving on. Now, every now and then that's important because that CEO was incredible, had a massive impact, was incredibly engaging, and people really felt connected to them. But the majority of the time, somebody in a call center, for example, goes, I couldn't give a rat's ass.
But I think that's the point, is that businesses are a microcosm of the laws of brand growth anyway.
And that's why you're on the episode.
You have a small because ultimately as you might with your your brand consumers or your wider market, is that there will be a small cohort of people who are super engaged in everything the business is doing, and then there will be a much larger group of people who are responsible for driving your business forward.
Yeah.
Just like that larger group of people who might only buy your brand once in a year, but they're responsible for, much of your volume in terms of your sales, who are just, in at work, who just want to turn up and do their job and go home. That's not to say that all of these things that are being done within an organisation is still signalling. It's still signalling to people that you're an organisation who is trying to do the right thing, and it's not going to do any harm to your business. But there's also coming to terms with the reality that in a big business with lots of employees, not everyone is going to be as engaged as you are, or whoever might be running initiatives and whatnot. But actually I do think that being as inclusive as possible and trying to involve people in the processes does help. I mean, I know, for instance, at Reach, we have been, we hired a head of D&I last year who's made such a huge impact in the business. And one of the first things, that was done was basically going and speaking to everybody. Bearing in mind we have 5,000 employees at Reach, there was a real concerted effort to speak to all members across all different levels to try and understand what people want, and even people that weren't traditionally you wouldn't expect to go along to these things went along because they felt involved. So I think there is a chance to include people and involve people. People will give up their time to engage with these things if they feel like they have a say, but it doesn't mean that then they're going to go away and then become champions, and it's going to become a huge part of what they do. But I think signaling is important, like it as much for recruiting new people to your business as well. I know from experience that the types of questions that people ask me in interviews now, people would never have asked me that 5-10 years ago. The dynamics are changing. People want to know what diversity and inclusion initiatives you're doing. They want to know what your approach to mental health is, what the approach to flexibility is. All of these things, which I quite like, because I think it puts the employee in control in a way that they might not necessarily have had previously, because there's so many dynamics at play. So I think very conscious of the fact that when you're recruiting for people, you're recruiting against other businesses who have has initiatives that you have to compete against as well. So,
and that's a very again, I don't know if you'd say hierarchy or talent orientated, but I'm pretty sure the Amazon driver isn't asking that question when he goes for a job, right?
No, absolutely.
So it's geared towards, and I hate to say the word talent because that's an awful phrase because it almost denigrates somebody that's doing a pretty labor-intensive job, but that sort of generic or vernacular phrase talent is people who can make decisions, I guess, who can walk with their feet. They may very well be in a situation where they're asking different questions.
I would say even at the very junior end of things, obviously I recruit all sorts of levels into my department, and even I think this is the point. The biggest change is actually those questions tend to come from the more junior people than they do the more senior people. So I don't think it's necessary. I don't think it's necessarily anything to do with kind of level or seniority. I think it's just the fact that these are issues that are being talked about regularly. It's part and parcel. It's just become ingrained in how people think about jobs and working. Of course, some people just want a job. They they don't ask these questions. But I suppose the point I was trying to make is the recruiting people now has changed.
Yes.
The questions people ask, the things they want to know, just wouldn't have had those questions 5 or 10 years ago. So I think the dynamics are changing essentially, and that's why all of these initiatives are so important to, like you say, attract talent, retain talent, make people feel that they're having a difference. So we have loads of these great initiatives across Reach, from kind of social mobility, which is obviously quite a passionate one of mine, and how we can reach out to to bring a more diverse workforce into the business. So internally I think it's huge.
Perfect. Well, listen, Andrew, we've covered a smorgasbord of things there, and I'm just alert to time for listeners, because I always say with a bottle of wine and the right food, I just go on with you all week. So
it's a bit early for a glass of wine.
It is, isn't it? I have to blow on my flask and pretend it's a cup of tea and not a gin. So listen, I'm going to bring us to a close. I'm going to say, Andrew, thank you so much for just spending some time with me just to have this conversation. I'll just keep you on for a few moments, but I'll tie in any links to Reach, etc., and any other social media that would be relevant for people to listen to. But just from me to you and those that are listening, Andrew, just thank you so much for your time.
Thanks for having me on.
That's it. So I hope you enjoyed the episode. Please share so others get to hear about us, and subscribe so you keep up to date on new episodes. Also visit livingbrave.com if you want to connect with me and find out more about executive coaching, team effectiveness and changing culture. Oh, and of course you can buy my book Living Brave Leadership on Amazon. So on that note, see you soon.